Spontaneous generation is the idea that life could arise from non-living matter. This is with the help of
Francisco Redi,
Lazzaro Spallanzani,
John Needham,
Louis Pasteur.
For centuries, people accepted the theory of spontaneous generation because of things like maggots growing on decaying meat. Francisco Redi did not believe this, so he decided to conduct an experiment with 3 jars in which they each had a piece of meat. One was completely sealed, one had gauze over it, and one was completely open. When he left them out, the flies would come. This is my fly. And they would come into the open jar and lay their eggs. On the one with the gauze, the eggs were just on the gauze, and then the one that was completely sealed, there was no form of maggots on them. Francisco Redi's experiment did not disprove spontaneous generation. Instead, he kind of laid the foundation for biogenesis, that life comes from pre-existing life because of the maggots came from the flies. And instead, John Needham challenged his beliefs, saying that spontaneous generation might not just happen in larger organisms, but it can happen in microorganisms, which then he made an experiment for.
John Needham's experiment consisted of boiling the broth, placing it in sealed containers, and watching for any growth. In his experiment, there was growth, and this helped to prove his theory of spontaneous generation. However, the problem with his experiment was that he did not boil the broth long enough for all the microbes to be killed. This would lead to the next experiment by Lazzaro Spallanzani, who would improve on John Needham's experiment.
Hi everyone! Ever wonder where the idea of life comes from? Well, scientists back in the day were trying to figure out where microorganisms come from. The big debate was spontaneous generation and the disapproval. The idea that life could just pop out of nowhere. In this case, I'm going to explain and illustrate Lazzaro Spallanzani's experiment. Back in the day, scientists were all over this idea, but one dude, Lazzaro Spallanzani, wasn't so sure. So he decided to put this theory to the test with a super simple experiment. Spallanzani took some broth that everyone thought could magically create microbes. He first boiled it to kill off any existing organisms. He then sealed one jar super tightly while leaving the other one left open to the air, or exposed to the air. Now the waiting game began. Can you guess what happened? The sealed jar stayed crystal clear, no microbes inside. But the unsealed jar, it turned cloudy with all sorts of living tiny life. Spallanzani's conclusion was simple. Microbes don't just appear, they come from air. But hold on, not everyone was convinced. People were stuck on this life force idea. They argued that Spallanzani's sealed jars didn't let this life force in, so of course nothing grew, or nothing appeared. For example, Needham, another scientist, even said that boiling the broth for too long killed the life force, ruining the whole experiment. Spallanzani's work was a huge step in understanding where microbes come from. It paved the way for later scientists like Pasteur, who finally ended this theory of spontaneous generation.
Hi everyone! Today we'll be talking about one of the biggest breakthroughs in science history, how Louis Pasteur disapproved spontaneous generation. For a long time, people believed life could just appear out of nowhere, like maggots forming from swirl meat. But Pasteur's experiments showed that that's not true. He used special flasks with long curved swan necks that looked just like this. Air could get in, but dust and microbes got trapped in the curve. The broth inside stayed clear and free of life. You proceed to break the swan neck of the flask so dust and microbes can fall into the broth, just like this. Once the neck is broken, microorganisms enter the broth, and it turns cloudy, proving life came from contamination, not from spontaneous generation. This idea is called biogenesis, and it changed science forever. Without this discovery, we wouldn't have modern microbiology, vaccines, or pasteurization. Thank you.